welcome you to this session. The session, as announced, is focusing on transparency and good governance on the Belt Road Initiative. But before we proceed, we received sad news, concerning a colleague who was to be actually on this panel and withdrawn a few days ago as his health was failing. And yesterday he passed away. And this is Professor Ian Taylor from the University of St. Andrews. So I would like us to observe a minute of silence in his honor and memory. Okay, yeah, thank you very much for that. So on this segment, we have 4 panelists, and they'll be speaking to us, as I mentioned, on this issue of transparency and good governance in relation to the belt. And I think, as was noted in yesterday's opening address, this is a very important initiative, one that, of course, we need to do a lot of research in terms of its how it's working, addressing issues that have arisen in terms of the debt issues, but there's also questions of organization, and there are questions of dispute settlement, and the question of transparency in terms of just knowing the projects and also the conditions relating to those projects. And I'm sure that our panelists are up to the task of addressing those issues. And just to mention, I noticed that on the question of dispute settlement, only a few days ago, the Chinese Supreme Court announced that they were appointing 4 Africans to the court in terms of being what they're calling a legal team for handling disputes on the belt. They'll be joining their Chinese counterparts. And these jurists are from Nigeria, Uganda, Egypt, and Algeria. So that's a very interesting development in terms of dispute settlement and how this is going to function. Now, the panelists, the first to go will be Ngozi Ngoko. He is a doctoral student at the University of Victoria in Canada. And I think in the interest of time, I'll be very brief in the introductions. His thesis focuses on the regulation of China-Nigeria resource infrastructure. And he holds a law degree from Osgood University, Osgood Law School and York University. So, Ngozi, it's your.
Thank you, Professor Ndolo, for the kind introduction. Today, I will be talking about some transparency issues of the Belt and Road Initiative and how to use some regulatory regimes to address those challenges. And as of the end of 2020, more than 30 African countries have signed up for the Belt and Road Initiative. The project is very popular and attractive to many African countries because of its capacity to fill infrastructure gaps in many African countries. It also promises to reduce overdependence on natural resources by many African countries. However, there are some challenges in the implementation of the Belt and Road Initiative. This is because some authoritarian and repressive regimes in Africa could use the implementation of the Belt and Road Initiative to undermine global efforts in preventing transnational bribery. And another challenge is that China has a non-interference approach, what they call 5-No approach in its international economic cooperation. So China does not interfere in the internal affairs of African countries. It does not also interfere in some development paths that are natural to and peculiar to African countries. If nothing is done about some of these challenges, the public trust in the Belt and Road Initiative could be eroded, and it could also lead to legitimacy deficit in the Belt and Road Initiative. But it is heartening that President Xi Jinping has recognized that the implementation of the Belt and Road Initiative could be a breeding ground for bribery and corruption to thrive. So he called on the international community to cooperate in establishing appropriate mechanisms to prevent bribery and corruption in the Belt and Road Initiative. So in response to President Xi Jinping's call, there is now established a thematic forum on clean Silk Road that was done in 2019 by China, some African countries, and other participating countries of the Belt and Road Initiative. The objective is to strengthen international cooperation in fighting corruption and promoting the rule of law in the Belt and Road Initiative. Another relevant development is that China has criminalized bribery of foreign public officials under its criminal law. So, and that is in fulfillment of China's obligation under the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, Article 16. And how do we activate public scrutiny in the implementation of the Belt and Road Initiative? So I also asked, who gets the Belt and Road Initiative contracts in Africa? Is it gonna be only Chinese companies? Although if the answer to that question is yes, that will be in violation of Article 9 of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption that provides that state parties should establish appropriate procurement systems that strengthens competition and transparency in contract award processes. So the meaning of that Article 9 of the UNCAC is that all bids or tenders should be treated equally regardless of the nationalities of the companies. And I'm also relying on Article 9 of the UNCAC to call on China to develop an enhanced transparency framework in the contract award process for the Belt and Road Initiative. So bidding rounds should be advertised publicly. The criteria of every bid should be clearly defined. This will go a long way in fostering greater transparency and a level playing field. It would also decrease the risk of transnational bribery in the Belt and Road Initiative. China and African countries should also create publicly accessible database on infrastructure projects of the Belt and Road Initiative. Contract awards, their values, the beneficiary companies should be reported transparently so that the public will know who got what. And the transnational and transcontinental nature of the Belt and Road Initiative is will require a movement of huge capital across borders, and that could be a recipe for bribery to thrive. So the Belt and Road Initiative is going to be funded largely by Chinese and African multilateral banks. I know that there will also be Western banks such as JP Morgan Chase Bank, the Bank of America, and other private banks in Africa. So there is a need for these financial institutions to strengthen their internal anti-corruption compliance procedures so that they will not be used as conduits to wire bribe across borders by persons and business enterprises. There should be some remedial actions if any contract award is established to have been tainted with bribery. There should be some remedial actions against any defaulting person. So under Article 34 of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, a state party such as China and the participating African countries could take legal steps to revoke any contract in the BRI that is established to have been tainted with irregularities. I also call on China state-owned enterprises such as institutions such as CESAC to develop effective regulatory and supervisory regimes for Chinese banks and other participating financial institutions. And another remedial action is for China to debar any defaulting company that engages in unethical practices in the Belt and Road Initiative. There is also a need for China and the participating African countries to conform with international regimes on anti-corruption. So currently, China is a principal actor in the global economic order. However, China has not signed up for the OECD Convention on Combating Bribery of Foreign Public Officials. However, China is also a key partner of the OECD on bribery in international business. And South Africa is the only African state to have adopted the OECD Convention. So I call on China to sign up for the OECD Convention on Bribery of Foreign Public Officials because of the significant enforcement potential of this regime. China's accession to the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention will no doubt enhance the reputation of Beijing, the Belt and Road Initiative, as well as the reputation of participating companies. And Article 13 of the UNCAC urges state parties to engage non-state actors such as civil society groups, non-governmental organizations, and local community groups. So China and participating African countries should engage these non-state actors so that the implementation of the Belt and Road Initiative will be transparent, and these non-state actors can help detect and prevent bribery in the implementation of the Belt and Road. Here are some of my concluding thoughts. So China and the participating African countries have an opportunity to use the Belt and Road Initiative to be standard setters and principal drivers of transparency and good governance. I call on China and African states to make the Belt and Road Initiative serve a transparent and commercially ethical purpose. China should demonstrate recommitment to the highest standards of integrity in the implementation of the Belt and Road projects. And a clean and transparent Belt and Road will be an antidote to some challenges in Africa, such as poverty, debt, social unrest, extremism, and local resistance. China's engagements with the OECD Working Group on Bribery will amount to mere window dressing if it does not take steps to sign up for the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Gozi. And thank you also for keeping to your allocated 12 minutes, just exactly 12 minutes. So thank you very much for that. So we will do questions later. Our next panelist is Professor Larry Becker. He is the W. Richard and Mary Oshman Faculty Scholar and Professor of Law and International Affairs at the Pennsylvania State University. So he's a graduate of Harvard and also of Columbia, JD. So it's your turn, Professor Becker.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted to be a small part of this and to make whatever small contribution I can, which I think for tonight, given the shortness of the time, is a set of maybe vocations, which hopefully will discussion, rather than look at this from a more technical or specific or country-oriented perspective. I'm going to be looking at this from the perspective of ideology, from the perspective of soft law, and with a systems focus. So we should keep this in mind. We start, of course, and I'm not going to spend very much time on this. We understand the grounding has brought us all here together. There are a set of reciprocal concerns. China, of course, is concerned about corruption and institution of its hub and spoke based prosperity and stability generating global system of trade or of its management and control of global production through the Belt and Road Initiative. I'm going to get into that in a little more detail. Africa, of course, and by Africa, we all know that we don't mean a singularity. We mean an extraordinarily complicated space of countries, peoples, religions, and the like. But for ease of discussion, we'll use Africa and then fracture it as we need to. We see concerns that deal with issues of dependency and fracture, protection of sovereignty. Here with a nod to Ian Taylor's just very recent article in a fix, which is worth reading. Again, the worries about the enhancement or the loss of internal controls, capacity building, which has been an issue for African states for the last 2 generations, and the construction of African unity, which has been the subject of African concerns for 3 generations. But that's the bipolar frame baseline within which we deal with these issues. And of course, we've got a number of challenges, many of which were discussed in the excellent presentations yesterday. Opacity, capacity, fracture, inequality, stability, and prosperity. These are all what we're looking at. The emphasis here, think about stability and prosperity, which from the Chinese perspective is absolutely core and central to one thinks about and situates the Belt and Road Initiative. And I'll get to that in a little bit. So my focus is going to be, I'm going to look at fairly quickly. I'm going to start with what we're supposed to be looking at in this conference. Look at transparency. I'm going to look at governance and governance, at least to try to figure out very briefly what we think we mean by both. And I'm going to posit that they are highly ideological concepts and highly political ones. I'm then going to consider the Belt and Road Initiative, again, as an ideological and political construct. And then I'm going to look at the collisions between these notions of good governance and transparency that come in from the West and international organizations, the political thrust and economic mechanisms of the Belt and Road Initiative that comes in from a different perspective, all colliding within, with, and through Africa. So that's hopefully what I'm going to try to do. All right, and so we start, everyone loves to talk about good governance and transformation. When I was here, I spoke a little bit as we were doing IFA, and I noted that there are a lot of words that have significance that in the West could be considered magic. Good governance is a magical word, a fetish, as is transparency. We beat nations, concepts, processes with it, but it's not clear to me what we mean, or actually we do know what we mean, but we don't agree on it. I use the World Bank's approach to good governance, which I put up on the slide, which they in turn have developed from out of sort of vague focus groupy interactions with donors, large foundations, and other people who they view as important. And all of them are focused on public law issues, but public law issues from a liberal democratic perspective, which you have to keep in mind when we're dealing with the Road Initiative, which is coming from a Marxist-Leninist perspective. So there's a conflict right there. The second conflict, of course, is that emerging concepts of good not really take into account the delegation and diffusion of government power out from the state and international system and into the production chain in private actors. So one worries about whether there's an ideology to this governance, and one worries about whether this ideology aligns with the Chinese vanguard and their conceptions, their political ideological conceptions that frames Belt and Road Initiative. Same with transparency. There are a number of contradictions that one can deal with. It's strongly interlinked with the integrity of political process, with anti-corruption, with efficiency of governance and good governance. But there are a number of contradictions with respect to transparency. How transparent are we? It's very contextually oriented. Are we going to be as transparent to the general public as we are internally? Are we going to be as transparent with our partners? It gets complicated, but the notion is at some point, in some way, in a very complicated and nuanced set of ways, we should be disclosing things to people in some cases somehow, and then ultimately eventually to the masses. But again, ideologically driven. The notion of transparency within Marxist-Leninist thinking is quite different than in development-oriented states, and quite different again in apex liberal democratic states and the OECD. But there you have it. Those are concepts. They become fetishes, and that's what we're going to look at. And then underneath all of this, especially in the context of good governance, are international soft law standards that ought not to be ignored. The UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights and their human rights due diligence standards, which are likely to be now formalized in law within the EU and then likely crammed down into Africa through not the BRI, but through the competitor European Union enterprises and production chains, the OECD systems, their principles for responsible investment, state-owned enterprises, and their guidelines for multinational enterprises, along with their quasi-litigation capacities through their specific instance, quote unquote, litigation. Sustainability development goals are important. And then we'll see what happens with these, with regional trade associations. We've got the African Court of Human and People's Rights that has finally geared up, and now brand new, the African Continental Free Trade Area, whose power, authority, and intervention is yet to be seen, right? All of this then transpires within BRI. I know I've got 4 minutes, so I'm going to go through this quickly. BRI is itself a fairly complex concept. I just want to make a couple points. One is that it's the outward expression of the core of the basic line of the Chinese Communist Party and the leadership of the collective. It has been a long time coming. This isn't a bad thing, but it's important to understand the fundamental integration between the ideological guiding leadership of the Communist Party and its responsibilities, both within China and then projecting China outward, and as the basic manifestation of the current basic line in the new era. There's been substantial ideological movement from the reform and opening up era that ended roughly between 2013 and 2018, and the genesis of new era thinking, which is effectively implemented in its outward expression through the Belt and Road Initiative. To understand it and its understandings of good governance and compliance, you have to understand the new era basic line, and you have to understand the way it fits into the approaches to economic and other relations. And again, here we're looking at it as an expression of the 12 core socialist values. Gossi already mentioned the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence and the centrality of Marxist and Leninist thinking through it. It's a very comprehensive system. These are all the components of BRI. We tend to think about it as infrastructure. Infrastructure is a predicate to what BRI is actually all about, which is a much more all-around comprehensive integration of not just infrastructure or economics, politics, culture, people-to-people exchanges, and the like. It shows up in 4 different ways: legal, security, culture, and infrastructure. Here's where the transparency issues are fairly important. BRI as a legal structure, standing between China and the BRI member states tend to be opaque in the extreme, not just in Africa. Italy is notorious, for example, as one of them. And it's the agreements, not only the memorandum of understanding, but the agreements between BRI partners and their host state analogs are also quite opaque as well. But we also, when we understand BRI, we have to understand it as security arrangements. We have to understand it as people to people, that is, as political capacity building along the lines of the Chinese, the success of the Chinese experiment, and then ultimately infrastructure projects. All of this then, from the African perspective, has to be, and I've just about run out of time, I know this, but this has to be understood through the long arc of history. We've got the BRI model now developed over the development model of the 80s, the colonialism model of the early part of the century, and then back to Marcus Garvey. And in the context of that, I go through a number of suggestions for breaking the traditional cycle of resistance for good governance. And on the African side, I don't have time to, I will only mention, if I may, just a couple of things. One is the cultivation of macro and micro governance. Soft law instrumentalism is important. Leveraging regionalism in Africa, master planning infrastructure, tech transfer, and ultimately projecting, using BRI to project African participation up the chain of production. I've taken up more than my time. Thank you very much. And I hope we can discuss some of this during the period.
Thank you very much. And again, you know, you didn't exceed your time. I think you kept your time. By my watch, it was exactly 12 minutes. So thank you very, very much. And again, I think we will defer questions that obviously must be there. And after these 2 excellent papers that we just had, and we now move on to the 3rd presentation. And this is by Badi Baude. He is the Deputy Executive and Africa Director at the Extractive Industry. He's a graduate of Harvard and the University of Conakry. Over to you, Badi.
Hello, can you hear me? Very good. Thank you very much. Thank you to the conference organizers for inviting me. It's a pleasure to join you. I'm saying hello from Oslo, where it is 2 a.m. in the morning. So bear with me here. Very quickly, to address the issue at hand, maybe I should say a few words about the organization I represent here. The EITI is a global standard for good governance of transparency in the extractive sector. We are implemented in 55 member countries around the world. We have it's a multi-stakeholder board that is implementing the EITI. To date, we have disclosed data in for over $2.7 trillion from the as a government revenues around the world. I should mention that 26 out of the 55 member countries are in Africa. Maybe I will come to the point about China and transparency, Chinese companies and transparency in this sector in a moment, but let me first explain how the EITI itself works. So we have three key features. First, we are multi-stakeholders, which means that both at the international and at the national level, it is a coalition of civil society, government, and companies who are designing and implementing the EITI. So it's a unique organization in that sense. We have state and non-state actors in all institutions of our organization. The second feature is about the core of our work is about transparency and public debate. And here it's a broad term where we promote the publication of information and dissemination of data to local communities. We hope that through that process, we help build trust. And a key feature here is that EITI is country-owned. So all disclosure requirements are applicable to the countries at the national level. So a while back, we conducted a short review. So from time to time, we review how the degree of compliance of various companies to the EITI. So we looked at the question very specifically, what is the degree of compliance of Chinese companies on EITI disclosure requirement in our member countries as opposed to other companies. The key findings are very much in line with some of the findings that you have done and Professor Deborah and others in Chinese activities more generally. We didn't find any meaningful difference in terms of degree of compliance. We found that Chinese companies were disclosing the information at the national level as required for the most part. There were a few cases where the Chinese companies had to update their record-keeping systems to align with the good practices of accounting procedures at the international level. And there are a few times where, especially for smaller companies, that they had to update not just the record keeping, but also their practices about how to record taxes and record taxes paid and so on, and bookkeeping more generally. So that caused some delays in the disclosures, but more generally, we found that, and at the time of the review, at least 130 Chinese companies around the world were involved in EITI reporting, and for the most part, they adhere to the disclosure requirements. We were surprised by the finding, given all the rhetorics that we are all aware of. So that will lead me to to my next theme here, which might be first to explain what is the value of transparency, to dig a little bit deeper here, at least when it comes to the extractive sector. We see many key areas here. First, it is to promote public debate. And here, our experience is that Chinese companies are agnostic to this matter. They will disclose the information. They prefer not to be asked more questions. So the issue of being held accountable by local citizens about their operations is a concept, I think it's fair to say, somewhat foreign to them. So they respect the authorities, they respect requests and orders from the government, but they have some apprehensions when it comes to citizens and asking for access to information or asking follow-up questions based on the information they have disclosed. So that is a challenge. Second is about information related to legal and fiscal reforms. And here, this is something Chinese companies do generally well in EITI member countries, because the EITI promotes an equal playing field approach to all the companies operating in a given country. And as long as the rules are the same, then there is a general adherence to that. Is through these disclosures, there is a recognition that can help improve the business environment, and that's something that Chinese companies also welcome as operators in those countries. And it's also important to note that when we say Chinese companies, especially in Africa, it's very often the case that it's asset that they acquire from a Western company. And the typical cases in countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, Chad, Niger, Zambia, and Mauritania, and so on, it's very often the case that they have acquired an asset from an Australian, Canadian, or American company, and they generally tend to keep management, at least when it comes to technical day-to-day operations. And they may have 1 or 2 people in a senior management on the finance side. But more generally, you don't see so much changes there. It's when Chinese companies themselves set up operation from the beginning, there you do see some difference in behaviors. But the issue of, for example, minimizing the risk of corruptions, it is something that I think it has been mentioned before. We don't see Chinese companies being more prone to this. At least we don't have any evidence that they are more prone to corruption than other companies, to be frank, or they are more susceptible to tax evasions than other companies. We don't have evidence to that effect. We have substantial amount of data that is now in the public domain, and we would welcome further analysis on this, that we have now disclosures at the project level in most of these countries, and that will allow for closer scrutiny and comparisons there, not just the contract, but also the practice. So in the interest of time, I will not dig deeper in so many of these themes, but just to say, so if I take few themes, like the understanding contract, for example, contract disclosures and so on, it's a good example where if you go to the EITI portal in the DRC, you will see as many contracts from Chinese companies are in for any other company. And some of the contracts, funny enough, when they were disclosed, some of them were in Chinese. I remember one of the more famous case is a SICOMIN agreement that was known as Mineral for Infrastructure Agreement that many of you are familiar with. That actually led us to update our own requirements to make sure that Chinese companies, that those kind of deals that are where the resource developer is advancing substantial amount of resources and developing infrastructure in exchange for future payment, he will then get recouped once the production begins. That's required a special kind of reporting that we had to design for specifically. That has now become more popular. It's no longer just practiced by Chinese companies, but that was an innovative aspect that came from them. So we had to update our own rules to catch up in those kind of innovative approaches, if you will. One key difference that I want to highlight, I'm not going to delve too much into this issue of license allocations, just to know that this is one area of high risk of corruptions. But again, we tend to approach this because EITA is implemented at the national level. The expectation is that the national laws should prevail and the government would put in place systems and procedures to allow for adequate licensing procedures that are open and transparent and applicable to everyone. It is true that Chinese companies are not going to go out of their way to go above and beyond some kind of CSR campaign to adhere to additional guidelines, but there is, if I can put it this way, a minimalistic approach, but adherence to whatever the government requires. So in that sense, it is incumbent on the government of those host countries to require the adequate publications and behaviors from all operators, including Chinese companies. One last issue relates to beneficial ownership, which we try to promote, which is to not only understand the deals, but understand also who is behind the deals. And here, more generally, what again, where the information has been required, we have not seen meaningful divergence between Chinese companies versus other companies. And again, keeping in mind that even the qualification of Chinese companies in some of these cases can be put into quotation, as it were. As I explained to you, it's a mixed, it's a more nuanced approach than what we are often led to believe from the public discourse. There is one area where Chinese companies have substantial challenges, I have to say, when it comes to disclosure, particularly on the extractive sector, and that's related to the environmental safeguards. It's very recently that we don't have as much robust data here as in the revenue flows, but it's following the 2019 standard where our international board agreed new reporting guidelines specifically related to the environmental issues. There, when you look at some key major violations and penalties imposed by government, especially African government, you will see that Chinese companies tend to accumulate quite a substantial amount of fines. One of the most stellar case that you may be familiar with is a case in Chad where CNPCI, which is the Chinese state-owned oil company, did have an incident of dumping substantial amount, or was accused of dumping substantial amount of toxic product to a river next to its oil fields, which had a serious negative environmental effect in the community and and more generally, actually, local communities were severely affected by that. So the government of Chad imposed a fine, and that fine, it was one of the largest fine of that nature. It was $1.2 billion fine in 2014. They ended up paying $400 million at the end. That was reported and reconciled in EITA reporting. So that's just one example to show that's one area where, in terms of behavior and practice, maybe Chinese companies may exhibit a substantial difference compared to others. So we'll be happy to delve into more details on all those issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much again for another excellent presentation. And our fourth speaker, panelist, is Professor Yves Timbergen. He's a professor of political science at the University of British Columbia. He's also a distinguished fellow at the Asian Pacific Foundation of Canada and the Universities of Alberta, China Institute. And welcome to the panel, and please go ahead with your presentation.
So thank you, Professor Ndulo, and I'm not going to use PowerPoint. I just have prepared a few key points, and we'll try to keep under 12 minutes. It's, of course, intimidating to speak after such a great lineup. I've learned a lot from all of you. This is really wonderful. And of course, also I should mention, you know, a bit in my field of political economy, the lead scholar on those issues is Deborah Bradingham. So speaking in front of her is always intimidating. She has better data than what I will present, but I will try to get a few key points, larger context. So I'm going to present a few bigger ideas coming from political economy to give framework for this discussion. So I call this the political economy of BRI, implications for Africa. Clearly, you know, the BRI is a big game changer, you know, for global development, for Asia, but also for Africa. However, it's been a process that was fast and furious. You know, extremely fast, faster than any institutional development could happen, and so it has led to many issues. And of course, it has now been operating within more complex geopolitics, and it's led to all kinds of confrontations. I think you know, Deborah Bradingham will know better than me that we can summarize the outcome overall in Africa, and in fact for the whole BRI spectrum of all countries, as very diverse. So it's not a story of systematic debt trap or systematic, you know, nefarious intentions. It's not also a story of systematic greatness all across the board. It's a story of great, it's a big spectrum with good cases and bad cases and middle cases. And so there really is a whole plethora of stories. And so the key is measuring dimensions. Do we measure by, you know, economic outcomes, by you know, environmental outcomes, social outcomes, political outcomes, and it's going to keep many people busy for a long time. The main argument I want to put forward is that BRI is fundamentally a decentralized operation, and therefore it's always a complex multi-level game. There is initially a built-in institutional deficit coming from China on the BRI. We tend to think, oh, there was this great strategic plan in a war room planning this thing like a chess game. But in fact, you know, there was a lot of ideological planning, as we heard from Professor Becker, but the actual initial operational document coming out of the NDRC was just 20 pages, was a vision. And it was a massive mobilization strategy to call on every actor all across China at all levels to do something about it. But it was not a very organized plan to start with. And so it's a very, you know, sort of very diverse operation. To realize its potential, the key going forward is clearly to institutionalize it much more. And that institutionalization is going to have to be at every level. Some of it has to happen on the Chinese side, some at the host side, some of it regional, some of it international. And the key word indeed is transparency, monitoring, and institutions. And those things were lacking at the beginning. There is some progress, but it's still very patchy. So now I'm going to say a few things on the origins, really, the political economy of BRI. Then a few more things on the process, the positives, especially in the light of Africa, and the impact, the negatives, and all the issues that have to be solved, and then some potential takeaways on what should be done, actually, on both sides, right, Chinese and African side. So the origin of BRI, as is well known, well documented by Professor Bradingham, is building, you know, when it comes to Africa, is building on the earlier investment process. There's a bit of a smooth continuation before and after 2013. And so it was called the going out strategy in the 2000s. We do see globally this acceleration in 2013 with the BRI strategy, along with the launch of the AIIB and the Silk Road Fund. But it's a complex moment. In my own work, I see the BRI thinking when talking to think tanks in Beijing and all this. Clearly, there was an interaction going on, and a lot of the think tankers were thinking in a competitive term with the US and with the TPP. So often in BRI discussion, I've been struck by how often the TPP came up. So the idea was, There's a pivot to Asia. The US is trying to shut down the game and of global rulemaking. We have to fight back. We have to open up the hinterland. And so we're going to have this massive strategy to develop an alternative to this TPP blocking us on the Pacific side. So that was part of the story. It's not the whole story, but this is part of a framework of competition for global rules and for setting globalization 3.0. I remember attending some conferences in Beijing in 2016, 2017, and the globalization 3.0 concept came a lot. They would say the first globalization was led by the British, 1.0, the second one by the Americans, and now this is the Chinese acceleration to globalization. Initially, they went along the Silk Road and Maritime Silk Road, and with a big focus on Europe, but very quickly, Africa got integrated into the Silk Road. It's completely decentralized. As noted by Professor Larry Becker, there's a lot of ideology and top principles, but very little initial operational documents. The big concept behind, I think the best way to understand it is, for example, the book by Justin Lin and Celestin Monga from 2017. Their book was called Beating the Odds, Jumpstarting Developing Countries. They use terms like engineering prosperity, performing economic miracles in the deserts. And the whole idea was to break infrastructure bottlenecks and to be able to leapfrog in development by having fast-tracked integration into globalization. Globalization, we used to study globalization as the triad. It used to be just Japan, Europe, and US, gradually extended to Asia and a few other places, but the BRI aims at expanding this globalization to the rest of the world. So that's sort of the origin. There's a lot of ideological components as well in terms of CCP ideology. Second, about the process, the initial NDRC document is 20 pages long. It's quite simple and neoliberal. It's all about integration, trade integration, people to people, financial integration, all kind of stuff like this. But it's a very, very decentralized operation to encourage bottom-up initiatives by companies, by provinces, by cities, by banks, of course, and even universities. Everybody has developed a BRI unit, a BRI think tank, and this and that. And I was struck in the early years how poor the coordination and centralization was in Beijing. Initially, I remember a few years ago, I was driven by the NDRC, and I was shown an office. The window was visible from the street. That was the former office of Western Development. And that became the BRI office in the NDRC. Initially, it was very small with 3-4 people. Now there's probably many more, but there was an office in the NDRC, an office in the Foreign Ministry, an office in MOFCOM, but there was not a great integration. And many actors went out, full speed to show. It's kind of like a campaign in the old days campaign to show that they have good 表现, they have a good attitude. And so the banks rushed out and everybody rushed out, but the banks did not have the ability to do return on investment analysis, and they didn't do good jobs, right? So they rushed into so many projects without all that preparation and monitoring. The speed was way too fast. There's no way you can have quality projects when you do $100 billion a year in the initial phase. The positives are new connectivity in globalization, the emergence of new nodes in globalization. Places like Greece, the port of Piraeus is doing very well. Hungary is becoming interesting in there. Kenya and Djibouti in Africa clearly are becoming global nodes. In Asia, we find Bangladesh, but there was an effort around Myanmar. It's always questionable around Myanmar. Sri Lanka was targeted, of course, as a potential hub. Indonesia, Thailand. So there's all those places that were on the periphery that are becoming nodes. In Africa, I was gathering data from 2013, 2017. So it's up to 2017 from BHI, this online database for all the ongoing construction projects that's under the NDRC. And what I found at the time for all the foreign projects up to 2017, that 56% were in Asia and 27% were in Africa, 12% in Europe. And in Africa, I was seeing that it was going up year after year. So the Africa piece maybe was not the first step, but got really growing fast. Quarter of the whole BRI. Among the top 10 countries for the number of projects at the end of 2017, I found 3 African countries. Kenya with 28, Algeria with 17, and Ethiopia with 15. So 3 out of 10. The first 3 were Pakistan, Indonesia, and Russia, and Kenya is number 4 for the whole BRI. So all this has also led, of course, to more, interestingly enough, competitive dynamic in Africa. I once had a discussion with one of the top economists of the African Union at a G20 summit, and she was saying, we see all the problems, we see a bunch of issues, and there's urgency on transparency, good governance, and all this. But we also see that, this is finally opening up the game in Africa. We are not trapped in very, very narrow situations. And of course, it's bringing competitive interest from other countries that don't want to leave the whole of Africa to China. So this has given leverage to African countries if it can be used correctly. Problems, number one is debt, as we know, partly from the lack of good homework on the return on investment. David Dollar at Brookings also has noticed that 25% of the Chinese lending only is concessional, 75% is commercial in US dollar and at variable interest rates. So that's high cost and high risk. There's been issue of debt transparency, and it's been noted a lot. One case that's often mentioned, David Dollar mentioned it in the past, Congo Brazzaville in early 2017 went to the IMF seeking a program to restructure its debt. However, Congo could not figure out how much it owed to China. And China, it turned out, was not able or willing to provide the data. It looked like China did not have an aggregate picture of what all the independent banks had done in Congo. And so the IMF program was difficult to get and couldn't be gotten at the time. We know also there are problems on the environment and on community engagement issues. When I do SDG scorecards, we find positive impact on the development opportunity nexus. So SDGs from 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9, 17, but uneven impact, or rather negative, on environmental sustainability scores. So SDG 12, 13, 14, 15, and a mixed impact, often negative, on equality and inclusiveness. So that's the SDGs 5, 10, 16. So it's kind of a mixed picture. What is needed is more Chinese government centralization. That's the irony, right? Which we often miss from outside. And I think Professor Browningham brought that point yesterday, that there's so many actors on the Chinese side and they all follow their own logic and they're not very well coordinated. And so as we talk of a BRI 2.0 since the summit in 2019, where Xi Jinping did talk about those questions of transparency, of greening, of coordination, there's an urgency to have more transparency of deals, better mix of debt with less high interest non-concessional finance, with more transparency about the actual cost, more systematic greening in the spirit of the SDGs, more stress testing on social inclusiveness, and also better coordination with other players, AU, African multilateral banks, and maybe other countries like Japan or EU, etc. So when I think of solutions, a BRI 2.0 environment in Africa, we can draw from the BRI summit in 2019, but also the G20 summit in 2019, where Japan got China to sign on the declaration of high quality infrastructure. And there was a bit of agreement, which was quite historic, between Japan and China over quality infrastructure. So what we find is the BRI is very plastic, works around and with domestic and regional institutions, but there is clearly a need to fill that institutional vacuum. I think what we observe is in countries like in the EU, where there are strong rules, labor rules and environmental rules, we find that BRI actors follow the rules and we're more likely to have a positive outcomes. Where there is weaker rules or there are domestic partners willing to offer special conditions, the individual players on Chinese side will exploit that vacuum and will therefore do differently. They could act differently in different countries. And so the lesson from that is it's critical to have leverage, to have rules, to be able, for the African host to say, we have constraints here, by our parliament or by whatever, the AU or whatever that is. Here are constraints. This is the non-negotiable part. And I think there is a good chance that the partners on the Chinese side will take those rules and will act differently. So building this in a systematic way, that's the big story. Huge need for transparency. I think the principle is understood in China, but it requires rules, as we have heard from Ngozi, and it requires the mobilization of all kinds of actors, civil society and others, to be able to call when the rules are not followed. I think the African Union has a big role to play, and then the monitoring of SDGs.
Try to conclude, please.
All right, so that was it. Thank you very much.
No, I said, okay.
Yeah, so conclusion
thank you
is
very much. I think
rules, AU, and SDGs.
So I think we have had really 4 excellent presentations, and there's a lot that we can discuss. And I have 3 questions, but I would like to pose a question. Abusing, I guess, my position as chair. The question of all these issues like corruption and all that, it seems to me on the matter that you've just been mentioning, Professor Tubagin, there is also the other equation that you are dealing with very poor governance in Africa. And that is a factor, in terms of negotiations, and that should not be ignored. Because when you're out there negotiating, if the government is weak, so there has to be capacity building in terms of the capacity of African states themselves. And you can see it in terms of the governments. Those that are better organized, they do strike better deals than the ones that we are referring to, the Chads and all these others. So I think there is this aspect which we must also consider on the African side, that there's some problem that we have to address there in order to be able to actually have this. And then my second question is, I think we identified all these issues, corruption, capacity, and all that. How do we solve it? Is it a question of bilateral discussions with China, or is it some institutional framework that can actually begin to address some of these issues? And if so, what can be done? And I think I'm posing my 2 questions to all the panelists, to kind of comment. And, please, the comment should be very brief so that we can go to the other 3 questions. So, any reaction to what I said? There's no reaction. Ngozi, we'll start with you. Or Professor Tipagin.
Yes, I think a bilateral discussion between China, Africa, and African countries under the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, as well as engagement with other intergovernmental institutions such as the United Nations, the OECD, will be very helpful in addressing corruption in the Belt and Road Initiative. China has been very, very influential and in very good times with African countries under the FOCAC. So that will be a good platform for a bilateral discussion on how to prevent bribery and corruption in China and many African countries that are currently operating under opaque ways.
Any other comments?
If I can come in here, I think that's a good point, Professor. I will make two points to that. One is, one of the I think the premise sometimes tends to be that there is a China problem when it comes to corruptions and all those issues, whereas the data is not there to justify that. So our suggestion would be, you are absolutely right. It is the African government who need to first step up and put in place systems and procedures that are hold all companies operating in their countries accountable. I know that is sometimes we know it will require time to evolve into that direction. It's not that something that can happen magically, and it has a lot of variables, especially when it comes to recent trends in Africa, where, quite frankly, democracy has had some setbacks recently, which is unfortunate. But we still believe that a pragmatic approach, much like what China has done, may be more helpful. And in that for example, the EITI we are not a magic solution by all means, but just having those kind of sector-specific approaches, rather than stigmatizing China or Chinese investment, having consistent and coherent ways and saying, these are the rules for doing business here, these are the environmental safeguards you need to adhere to, these are the good governance and practices we expect of everyone, and all investors are welcome, but you have to follow these rules. That's what is needed, I think, and my recommendation is a more active, ideally, collaboration across African government as well, to push each other, to emulate each other in adopting those practices and developing their legal framework in that regard. Thank you.
Right. And if I may just interject a tiny second, what we see here is not anything new. The Liberal Democrats, the OECD, World Bank, and IMF projects to create and organize global production and to move forward projects of good governance and transparency have been at least a generation old. The problems that we understand that they present for developing states are nothing new. The galaxy of possible approaches are nothing new, in the sense that China or African states can develop approaches. What is new, and the possibilities here that present something quite interesting, is that China, at least with respect to these issues, presents a different sensitivity to what might be valued and the order in which things might be approached, that are very different from what had been pushed by the Western IFIs and the liberal democratic community. And that for Africa presents both a little bit of a challenge, but a tremendous opportunity. And I kept emphasizing this, Chinese notions of stability and prosperity, rather than a focus of civil and political rights driving economic development, poses a very interesting alternative view, but that will also be dependent, and this is something that there's a challenge to the Chinese mission in the UN a couple of years ago. In the context of the Business and Human Rights Forum, it will require China through BRI to actually fully develop the structures that they claim they have. That is a socialist approach to business and human rights, a socialist approach to good governance, and to do it in a way that then actually conforms to their to the five-factor foreign policy that they have. Last, all of this will become effective only as and to the extent that Africa does the impossible, and that is to begin to actually leverage, the way the Europeans did, as unsuccessfully as they did, more successfully than people expected, to leverage the possibilities of regionalism in everything from infrastructure, and you see a little bit of that now, which is good, but regionalism in terms of infrastructure development, in terms of the massing of resources, and in terms of using their relationship with China to move production up from merely selling resources to interesting the Chinese in placing its processing and development within Africa itself until they get high value product or high value portions of production chains within Africa. The Africans will wind up having the same problems that they did for a generation and a half as they struggled through development and development ideals under liberal democratic models.
Can I add a couple words? Do we
Yes,
still have
please.
time?
Okay.
Yeah, so those are all fabulous comments. So it's all about building the right leverage, the right institutional, sort of credible institutions on the side of the negotiation with the Chinese partners. And you're right to note the challenge is when you face host government that doesn't have strong institutions that are credible, that are well enforced by legal systems, or pursued by civil societies and the like. And I guess, to avoid too many problems, because, of course, it's a matter of time, having some outside help is critical. My first guess is the African Union. So I agree with Professor Becker on regionalism. I was very impressed by what the AU did with COVID, right? The CDC, the African CDC, it's so new, it's 5 years old or 4 years old, and it has had a huge impact. Or the one-stop place for all the purchase of PPE, and then of course working with COVAX. So that's a good example. There has to be something credible and acceptable. With respect to Ngozi, I'm not sure that the OECD is the best avenue, because the Chinese are always a bit skeptical with the OECD, because it's not their shop, right? This is a totally Western shop. They are not full members, and they're always being pushed around and such. So a comfortable place for China. China comfortable with G20, probably okay working with AU, or the new institutions like AIIB. AIIB has a great reputation so far, thanks to Jin Nichun. Very good governance, to some extent even better than World Bank. I heard this from a former high official of the World Bank. And so there is hope with those institutions. The G20 agreement in 2019 between Japan and China, but endorsed by everybody, on good quality infrastructure is a good starting point, because that's something fully accepted by China. But I think the fastest way ultimately is to get the Chinese to do something. So I think you're right on SASAC, or, they basically, and it's not just an African problem, it's the whole Belt and Road, right? In a way, it would be more efficient if the Chinese side can discipline its actors going out, yes, which it hasn't been able to do. But they're not unique in that problem. I noticed that the Japanese in the past were not very good disciplining their actors outside Japan. And to this day, they're still building coal plants, right, outside, which finally the current Japanese government is trying to come to an end with. So it's always harder to discipline your actors outside, and they don't have good institutions for it. So maybe the AU and certain actors should come up with a very unified plea to Beijing to have better ways to police the actors and agree on a bunch of principles of what they should do.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we have so far 3 questions, but I see that there are more coming. Then I have to ask these first 3 and then try to read the others. So the first question is to Ngozi, and the person asking says that that you seem to suggest that existing Western accountability mechanisms, such as the UN, World Bank, or OECD, are the solution. And he says, how well do these existing liberal institutions, how well can they deal with the new challenges in terms of BR initiative?
Yes, my response to that is that so far China, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and other Asian institutions have been partnering with the OECD working group on transnational bribery. So the OECD has been nudging China and Asian multilateral banks to join and sign up to the convention. So that is very reassuring. That is a practical step that the OECD has been taking, and is also welcoming China to its meetings on transnational bribery. But more importantly, many Chinese engineering and construction companies that will be executing the BRI projects are either registered in the US or in the UK. So that means that their shares are traded on the floor of New York Stock Exchange or the London Stock Exchange. So those companies could be held accountable if they engage in unethical practices in the BRI implementation. However, the accountability mechanism will be expanded if China actually accedes to the OECD convention.
So, yeah, we have more questions flowing in. So I'll appeal to panelists to be brief so that we can accommodate all of them, because I see our time is like we've only 15 minutes left. So the second question is to Bowdy. And the question is that the data that you give on the activities of the EITI, reporting mechanisms, and the questioner's question is that how often are these statistics updated, and how can the audience access these reports so that they can get the relevant information for for them to get engaged? So that's the question.
Yeah.
So how often do you update your data, and secondly, how do you ensure that the ordinary person gets access to information?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So as a transparency initiative, we ask all member countries to publish reports on an annual basis. So reports generally there is generally a 2-year time lag. So for example, the last batch of report that were published in December generally covers 2018 data. So there is that delay, and that's because there is a lot of auditing and verification that goes behind the scenes. But there are a few countries where the data is more up to date than that, is where we have 2019 data and so on. So that's to the point about the freshness of the data. Then the analysis, you are right. The questions refer to the analysis. Yes, we don't update the China specific analysis regularly. Again, for us, China is just companies operating in the country. The Chinese attribute is really a minor variable. We are trying to enforce transparency and good governance practices for all companies operating in the sector. But the data is available on open format. Most of the data is available on open format, and I will share a link along with the slides to the API tools. Well, the data can be downloaded and analyzed by colleague. And if I may, the second question that I see on the comments there about is China exporting its governance practices abroad and so on, I would say yes and no, because as an influential player, you do see obviously there is an organic growth in the way adoptions and exchange of ideas and so on. So for example, the fact that the state-owned companies tend to dominate the Chinese economy is very often state-owned company-led economy. So that model is very much often copied by countries. So if you look at some of the key sectors, you see government setting up those state-owned companies as well to copy that model, which we are trying to address with a number of them, because those state-owned companies, there are quite a number of criteria in order to have an SOE that is successful in its work and that fulfill its dual mandate, both commercial and regulatory, is a very tricky thing to do. And so it's not easily copied model. That's the message we try to convey to government who tend to copy and replicate that blindly. But it's a good question that probably worth more analysis. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So the next question is to Professor Becker. And the questioner says, you made a comparison to colonial past of Africa. Would you say that the BRI mechanisms on infrastructure projects are doing African countries more long-term benefit than the European projects during the colonial period of that time, that, you know, whatever, the European powers of that time, that is there really a huge difference, or are they in impact? Or it says because you refer to colonial past, that how do you rate the new contracts on infrastructure especially?
Right. I mean, there's a simple answer now, and thank you, God, for time. And the simple answer is way too early to tell. It's way too early to tell. You had a generation or so. Each of the prior projections of power into Africa were several generations long, and its ramifications were unclear at the time. And if I would have sat in Africa in 1910 and been asked that question about the value of the new colonialism, I really wouldn't have been able to give you an answer that would have made sense with what we know after 1930 or 1940. So way too early to tell. What the colonial past does do is provide China with an enormous challenge, because Africa has now built a 300 or 400 year well of distrust of people coming and bearing gifts in exchange for things. And the African nations and the peoples of Africa have learned all kinds of mechanisms for both welcoming, distancing, and then ultimately making the lives of those who come in uncomfortable. So in a sense, the challenge for China is a challenge of developing trust enhancing and confidence building measures. And that, more than anything else, will probably in the middle and long run will be far more important in determining this thing. At the same time, we have to remember that China's own objectives in Belt and Road are necessarily going to be different than those of either individual African states or of African regions. And so to some extent, the question about the value of this will be inherent in the ability of African states to leverage the flexibility of China to make BRI investments more compatible with African state or African regional objectives than they had the opportunity to do with either the direct colonial past before the 1950s, or within the fairly rigid market-based and factional structures of liberal democratic globalization. It's a long answer to the question. It's too early to tell, but it can go either way. And it really is not just up to Africa as well.
Okay, thank you very much. So another question to Buddy. Well, not just Buddy, I think this is a general question. You said that many of the speakers refer to Chad as an example of a bad project. And the speaker says, but that's an odd case. aren't the speakers aware of the issues relating to Myanmar, Peru, and in terms of some of the agreements that have gone on there? That what are the lessons to be learned from that?
Yeah, I think I can address first on that briefly to say that we are aware of those challenges, and I just gave Chad as an example on the environmental issue just because it was such the amount that was involved as a fine was quite unprecedented in its magnitude. But it's not the only case. We can talk about the DRC all day, about Chinese companies in the DRC. We follow the cases of Myanmar and Peru very closely as well. And there, as soon as Chinese companies acquire new assets, again, there is this period of hype, if you will. Does this, how fundamental is this going to fundamentally change the sector, and so on and so forth? In some cases, yes. In others, no. It's very much a mixed bag. I guess as a way of, for me, as a concluding remark on all of these points, is that it touches on the previous question as well. To what extent Chinese companies are having more positive or negative effect than others. As the speakers, my colleague on panelist says, it's too early to tell. I would just remind everyone historically that if you think of European countries, here, I live here in Norway, up to 1994, bribe abroad was tax deductible here in Norway and in most of European countries. And some of you may be familiar with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act that was signed by President Carter in the 1970s in the United States. That was a landmark law that tried to prohibit Western companies from going abroad and practicing these issues of bribery and so on. But before that, bribery was tax deductible. And that meant, and most of Western companies also had export banks, which subsidized those practices. So it's, yes, maybe the practices from China are not where we want them to see them, but there is a roadmap, and others had not been perfect in this area either. And we just need to learn from the mistakes from the past and not necessarily stigmatize anyone, and also not infantilize the government of host countries. They really need to step up and take the responsibilities, and because somebody else cannot build their institutions for them. They have to do that themselves.
I think one final question relates to dispute settlement. So it's addressed to Ngozi. And he said, what is the likelihood of China to use arbitration in the settlement of disputes that arise in the BRI? Very briefly, we're running out of time.
Yeah, so China has interestingly established a parallel arbitration mechanism to resolve BRI disputes. And as Professor Dolo mentioned during the intro of this panel, China has appointed some African judges into the international arbitration panel. And this arbitration is conducted under the New York Convention on International Arbitration. So they use the rules of the New York Convention. So that appointment of African members is a good step in the right direction. So China will, I think, conform with international best practices on arbitration, because this appointment of African judges gives balance and fairness. It brings balance and fairness to the arbitration institution.
So I think we are coming to the end of our panel. But before we do that, I think I would like to give just 1 minute to each one of you to make your final statement. If there's something that you'd like to say before we close. We start with you, Professor Becker. 1 minute, each one of you. One final words of wisdom, final words.
Oh, good Lord.
Any?
No words of wisdom other than just to sum up, the Belt and Road Initiative presents an for China and Africa, and as well an extraordinary opportunity for the liberal democratic West to think about and look at ways in which they understand economic activity, the relationship between states, private enterprises, and economic activity, and the principles under which all of these should be undertaken in the context of an increasingly interconnected world. Whether we're up to the challenge or not remains to be seen, but I think on all of this is a positive development for Africa and certainly for China.
So, Ngozi?
Yeah, I want to say that the BRI initiative provides African countries an opportunity to be integrated into the global investment system. So the construction of infrastructure projects across African countries will stimulate trade and enhance Africa's opportunity to be a major player in international investment order.
Thank you. Professor Tiba again.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Ndulo. This has been fascinating. Thank you to all of you. I learned a lot. I would say that the BRI is in this huge game changer, and it has opened up a lot of new avenues and a lot of new infrastructure, and it has opened up the interface between Africa and global economy. But it's also a big experiment. It's classic Chinese tradition of crossing the river by filling the stones. We heard that yesterday. And so we are at the stage where institutions have to be built, and African countries, African Union, African civil society has to be co-creator in those institutions. And this is the huge opportunity, but it's quite urgent.
Thank you very much. Buddy?
Thank you very much, everyone. I also learned a lot. Two parting remarks. One is that with power comes responsibilities. China is obviously a superpower, and therefore it is normal to expect of them to step up and take responsibilities for their actors beyond their borders, to model good policies and make sure that they are having an influence, taking responsibility and encouraging good practices beyond just making a profit. So that is something when we say China needs to be a responsible actor in the global stage, I think that is fair. It's a fair expectation. The second point is that we also should avoid the mistakes of the past in the sense that there is too much of comparison to colonialism, neo-colonialism, competition for resources. I think there is too much of the West looking at China's involvement in other countries through the lens of their own past in those countries. And it doesn't need to be yet another competition for resources and so on. So there is an opportunity for collaboration. I agree with the panelists' sentiment that this is overall an opportunity for poor countries to catch up why it's an opportunity for attracting foreign direct investment, and that can be developed responsibly if we put the right framework in place. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so it remains for me to thank each one of you, really for your excellent presentations and your collaborations throughout this session. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank Ngozi Moko and Dr. Ying Xia for organizing this panel. It takes a lot of work. It's been over a long period of emails and trying to contact all of us. And also, thank you most sincerely for inviting us to come and join in this discussion. This is a very important topic, as we all have noted, and may very well, change the course of Africa. And I think that it is something that we as scholars should do, engage in terms of research with a view of offering better solutions, so that the whole initiative, as the Chinese would say, is a win-win situation for both sides. So once again, thank you very much to all of you. Goodbye. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
Tia and Ngoko.
Thank you guys for coming.